Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey, this is the battle that I always have that background picture. I never knew exactly where it was from, but I liked it. And I assume it's in the Hundred Years' War, but I don't know. Another battle that is familiar, the name that I don't know about is Agincourt, that I don't really know. I can't tell you much about it. I'd also like to learn about that. World Graphics is a phenomenal channel. Again, Biographics, Geographics, all of these are great channels. This guy's great host. Preemptive like. So is it Crecy? England Rises. My name's Connor. I like to learn. Let's go.
It's France in 1346 CE. Life as a French commoner or farmer has never been easy. It was, after all, the high to late Middle Ages, and while France was the most prosperous kingdom in all of Europe, as an average Jean, you didn't exactly catch much of that prosperity. And things suddenly were about to get a whole lot worse. In 1337, English King Edward III was up to some shenanigans and decided to declare himself King of France after the previous French king, Charles IV, had died in 1328. You see,
is that Longshank's son? Or
he is French king, Charles IV, had died in 1328. You see, he had the audacity of not having a male heir, so his inheritance was up in the air. His cousin Philip, Count of Valois, had jumped at the chance, and so did Charles' nephew Edward. One thing led to another, and no one wanted to back down from what to them felt like their birthright. 1337 then was the year where somewhat passive conflict boiled over and an era of war began in earnest. The 100 Years' War had kicked off.
oh, okay, so it's the start of the Hundred Years' War. Okay.
Lasted from 1337 to 1453 and pitted France and England against each other, along with other powers who had allied with them for one reason or another. The main area of conflict was the French countryside, which was left in dire situation. Estimates speak of 3.3 million deaths, partially because of the fighting itself, but also due to cruelty against the populace and other things like that.
Were they really that close to each other? Firing arrows?
But it wasn't just brutality. The 100 Years' War was a complex construct of war, politics, peace treaties, civil unrest, ascension crisis, you name it. Out of this war, 4 isolated battles stand out as being particularly noteworthy: Crecy, Poitiers, Agincourt, and Castillon.
Okay, Agincourt is another. It's just like I didn't know what it was, but it was just a name that I knew. It's like Agincourt. Oh, that's familiar, and so it must be pretty important then.
Today on Graphics, we're going to bring you the story of the Battle of Crecy, England's first major curb stomp battle against its traditional enemy. We can bring you the others if you want them in future War Graphics videos. Please do let me know in the comments
Agincourt.
below.
Agincourt. Please. Awesome videos.
Sure, there had been other battles before Crecy, but nothing quite of the impact that Crecy had. It was indisputably the first major battle of the 100 Years' War. This conflict had its root in 2 aspects: an internal struggle for hierarchy and respect, as well as a conflict for the French crown itself. Now, I'm afraid it gets a little confusing here because, well, we have to do a little bit of time travel, but bear with me, it's important to understand the background of how Crecy happens.
Okay.
In 1066, we're going way back, a duke from
Hastings.
Normandy, the northern parts of the French kingdom, claimed the English throne for himself. He amassed a huge army, grabbed some noble buddies, and hopped on over the channel. He then proceeded to kick some Anglo-Saxon, back then the inhabitants of England, ass and make himself the head honcho. The whole affair was called the Norman Conquest, and that duke's name was William of Normandy, who was later known as William the Conqueror, or also, fun fact, William the Bastard. So far, so good. However, William was still the Duke of Normandy. Unlike what video games like Crusader Kings might make you believe, your becoming a king doesn't mean you stop being a subordinate to the king you swore your fealty to. So, William was now a king in his own right as ruler of England, but he also had to accept the French king as his boss. When
okay.
Willie died, this curious situation was carried on as his boss. When old Willie died, this curious situation was carried on by his successors. These successors and the noble descendants that William had brought with him to England eventually ruled over holdings in France that were larger than what the French crown had. These holdings eventually became known as the Angevin Empire. Needless to say, the English king and his vassals were exceedingly powerful and competed with the French king for real power in France. As a short detour, it was also during this period that an important law for England's success during Crecy was instituted. In 1252, the Assize of Arms was established. It basically told the populace, alright, if you're in this and that class, you need to own this and that armor in case I ask you to go off and die for me. The competition between the English and French kings reached a peak around 1280. By then, the French king was all like, whoa, hold up, guys. I'm king in France, and I'm your king's king. Can you please just, chill? Give me back all that territory, which it's kind of mine. Obviously, the English king wasn't going to take this lying down, and he resisted, but the French crown managed to sap away huge chunks of land from his unruly little vassal. When it was time for the 100 Years' War, English possessions in France were reduced to the Duchy of Gascogne, a comparatively small part of western France. Even though the English kings had lost their ancestral Duchy of Normandy, they were still French vassals, just now as Dukes of Gascony. All this boils down to a key component of the conflict breaking out. The English king was supposed to pay homage to the French king. To pay homage means quite simply to acknowledge another noble as your direct superior. But guess what? The English king flat out refused to do that, adding high-octane fuel into the already roaring fire that was Anglo-French tensions. The other major part of the 100 Years' War was an ascension crisis. As a reminder, in 1328, the last French king of the Capetian dynasty, Charles IV, died without a male heir. By traditional law, his closest male relative, his cousin, Count Philip of Valois, was seen as the new legitimate king of France. However, because his mother was Charles IV's sister, so he was Charles IV's nephew, King Edward III, King of England, also lay claim to the French throne. When old Eddie noticed that his diplomatic approaches towards his French relatives bore no fruit, he decided to start banging the drums of war. In 1337, Edward attacked the small island of Cadzand in Flanders, at the time a semi-autonomous region of the French kingdom, and, well, with that, the 100 Years' War had officially begun. With the background established, let's jump ahead to 1346. The war had been going on for 9 years already, and Edward III and his Flemish, from Flanders, now in Holland, allies were getting ready for a large-scale attack on the north of the French kingdom. As a quick note, all events we discuss in this video take place in northern France, and when we say northern France, we mean the tip of Normandy from Cherbourg to the peak of the county of Artois with Calais. From July the 12th onwards, northern France was ravaged by the English troops who'd headed over the Channel from Portsmouth and landed in St. Vaast-le-Hogue. The first high point in this invasion took place on the 26th of July, when the English captured the traditional Norman centre of Caen. They then pressed everything out of the city, much like someone would squeeze everything out of an orange for some juice. Edward's troops also managed to take some prisoners, amongst which was the Constable of France at the time, Raoul of Eu. The Constable of France was, de facto, the number 2 to the king in all terms military, so his...
Just so you guys know that this is a really new subject to me, 100 Years' War. I might have watched a video about some parts of it in the past, but none that I solidly remember, and so gonna have a lot of learning. Any comments I do make will likely just be questions, like usual.
Capture by the enemy was, de facto, the number 2 to the king in all terms military, so his capture by the enemy was, let's say, unfortunate at best. Afterwards, they went their merry way to a projected rendezvous point. Raoul also managed to take some prisoners, amongst which was the Constable of France at the time, Raoul of Eu. The Constable of France was, de facto, the number 2 to the king in all terms military, so his capture by the enemy was, let's say, unfortunate at best. Afterwards, they went their merry way to a projected rendezvous point with reinforcements sent from England. The French, meanwhile, were, well, pretty screwed. The English attack in northern France and the now formerly very rich city of Caen, in particular, completely tripped up the defenders. Most of their army, meanwhile, was being caught in warfare in the south. Additionally, the French royal coffers were only filled with spiderwebs and a little bit of dust, so, well, motivation was quite low. The English, meanwhile, made staggering progress progress, arriving at Poissy just 20 miles away from Paris on August the 12th. In their wake, they left a massive path of death, destruction, and devastation. That bloody path nearly even reached the capital itself. King Philip VII of France's remaining troops gave chase until they reached Paris and encamped there, getting some respite. With morale rebuilt, Philip sent a formal challenge to Edward III, kind of like a save the date for an orderly knightly battle on August the 16th. Edward responded with, "Sure, I'll be there," but he then proceeded to not show up. How rude. Eddie then proceeded to light up Poissy like a Christmas tree. Literally, he burns bridges and he moved northeast. After realizing Edward tricked him, Philip made haste, moved parallel to Edward's troops, and finally nestled in at Amiens.
I love how cordial that seemed and so like nonchalant. Like, hey, what's up, man? So like August, like the 14th or something, battle. Yeah, sure, man, I'll be there.
By the River Somme. On their way, they made use of scorched earth tactics to ruin English foraging attempts, starving out their enemies. Philip also tried to block off every ford and bridge across the length of the River Somme and the Channel. The blockade trapped the English, who now had to fear a fight against the French, who'd nested in defensive positions. The two forces constantly were very close to one another, which offered little opportunity for some proper rest. At one time, the English had set up their camp at a show in Normandy, while the French army was merely 6 miles away, camped at Abbeville.
Do they have cannons?
During the night from August the 24th to the 25th, 1346, the English marched out to capture a ford named Blanchetaque, defended by around 3,500 French. These men, however, were no proper match for the mounted men-at-arms that charged them, and they fell like flies to these fearsome longbow archers. The following hours and days showed signs of arrogance and a lack of foresight that would come to kick the French's butt several times during the war. Bit of foreshadowing going on there. After Edward III crossed the Somme, he had managed to shake off the main part of the French army, who'd merely captured a few soldiers and some wagons. However, they didn't think that Eddie would evade being surrounded, and
Guys, not having extreme long-range weapons, like any sort of missiles, or I guess arrows are technically missiles. Any sort of like gunpowder. It's just crazy how when everything really has to be decided up close and personal, how different combat must have been.
So once they broke free, Edward was free to forage and resupply in the area beyond the Somme. However, Edward III
not just combat. I heard that in the Somme. But just like wars in general. And
news that his Flemish allies dropped out, which meant that he wouldn't receive any reinforcements. However, Edward was all like, screw them. We got this, right, boys? Making the best of this, shaking off the French pursuers, Edward set up a defensive position at Crecy-en-Ponceau, or just Crecy for short. Here, the English waited while the French enemies steadily approached. Before we finally...
I gotta pee quick, guys. Be right back. Good pee time break. Be right back. Go to the bathroom. Okay, everyone use the bathroom. All right, it got cold too, so. Okay.
Come to the battle itself. Before we finally come to the battle itself, here's an overview of the troops that fought on each side. The English army, estimated to be between 7,000 and 15,000 troops by most modern historians, was made up almost exclusively of English and Welsh soldiers, with only a few soldiers from other areas of Europe. Regardless of the actual number of troops, the numerically dominant type of troops were longbow archers, making up between roughly a third and a half of the troops. Other soldiers who were present were light infantry or mounted archers, spearmen infantry used to stop horse charges and keep enemy infantry at a distance, and men-at-arms. Usually, they were heavy cavalry.
I pointed out in one of the Alexander videos, which I'll do the next episode today or tomorrow. I made a comment about it was strange how Alexander was using his archers. Because Alexander the Great, did I say it? He would like put him in front and like bait out the enemy or something like that. And someone said, if you think this is crazy, you should see the Battle of Agincourt. I think that's what you said. And so I'm curious when I learn about that battle what you mean.
Though enemy infantry at a distance, and men-at-arms. Usually, they were heavy cavalry, though not exclusively knights. At Crecy, though, they fought on foot. Roughly speaking, depending on their wealth, they wore chainmail or plate armor, a variety of helmets, and they carried heater shields, usually already decorated with heraldic elements. They were armed with spears, axes, swords, or pikes. French men-at-arms were...
And they really had those head coverings for horses where... like, you know what a strainer is? Like when you put pasta in, so the water goes... They had the metal surrounding with a few holes in it.
Armed with spears, axes, swords, or pikes. French men-at-arms were probably equipped similarly to the English ones. Military gear back in the day was sort of a cookie-cutter concept. On the attacking French side, it was even less certain how many soldiers they fielded. Contemporary estimates range from between 72,000 to 120,000.
That's a lot.
Most modern historians think that number to be exaggerated, though. Dr. Clifford J. Rogers of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point simply puts the number of French troops at twice or thrice that of the English soldiers. Most modern estimates think of around 8,000 men-at-arms on horseback, 2,600 mercenary crossbowmen, and a huge host of common infantry who by themselves outnumbered the entirety of the English. And speaking of crossbowmen, since Philip VI had taken the reins of France, crossbowmen had become increasingly popular, usually as mercenaries. A crossbow of that era could eject a bolt with an effective range of about 200 meters, which made their effective range less than that of the English longbow. 200 usually as mercenaries. A crossbow of that era could eject a bolt with an effective range of about 200 meters.
An effective range of 200 meters, so that's like 200 yards. I think a meter is slightly larger than a yard. But so that's like 2 football fields. Effective range, that's pretty far.
Which made their effective range less than that of the English longbows.
The
However, their handling was much easier, which meant that less time was required to practice, so this meant that more people could be recruited. At the time, up to 3 crossbowmen hid behind so-called pavises, massive wooden shields that were erected in front of these soldiers to protect them from oncoming damage.
I like that shield a lot.
The English defence line was cleverly picked. Wedged in between the settlements of Wadincourt and the eponymous Crecy, the English were arranged in 2 lines, with the second line being on a slightly elevated position. The English archers especially benefited by taking a book out of Obi-Wan Kenobi's book and having the high ground as it maximised their range.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
You underestimate...
Not only did they have the high grounds, but with them being wedged between the 2 villages, it also made it a lot harder for the quick-mounted French men-at-arms to outflank them. And
I'm sorry, I'm not saying Revenge of the Sith is the best Star Wars movie, but that battle scene between Obi-Wan and Anakin is maybe my favorite part in all of the movies.
Case, there was an opening in the back of the formation to allow an orderly retreat should the French overwhelm the English. To minimize the risk of that happening, the English, who'd arrived early, started digging pits and trenches to slow the advance of the French cavalry. Their morale was high after shaking the French pursuers not too long ago. Also, due to their early arrival, they had plenty of time to catch a breath and have a power nap. Probably. The English force was split into 3 battalions, a vanguard, a left battalion, and a reserve. The vanguard was commanded by Edward the Black Prince of Wales, King Edward III's son and heir, alongside the Marshal and Constable of the army. As was the case in France, the Constable of England was also the commander of the army, only outranked by the sovereign himself.
And he was named the Black Prince, I could be completely wrong here, because he liked to joust and he wore black armor. Am I wrong there?
The Marshal of England was also the commander of the army, only outranked by the sovereign himself. A marshal, meanwhile, traditionally was responsible for the horses and the stables. The left battalion was under the command of Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, a distinguished commander and admiral. The reserve, meanwhile, was commanded by King Edward III himself. These 3 battalions all had the same structure. Men-at-arms in the centre, spearmen behind them, flanks of archers in a small skirmish line in front. Skirmishing here can be seen as harassing the enemy by sometimes firing arrows at them, retreating again, etc. And while it may seem counterintuitive to have squishy...
Sorry guys, maybe you explained this and I didn't get it, but when he says men-at-arms in the front, I thought men-at-arms would just talk about the entirety of just the army. So men-at-arms was a certain... Does that mean like at arm's length or just aren't they all at arms? What the men at arms are in the front?
Archers at the front, they were protected by the beefy, steely tanks that were the heavily armored men-at-arms. The last part that was important to the English defense was their baggage train in the back. It was both a parking spot for the men-at-arms horses, but it was also defended and served as a blockade should some French troops manage to circle and attack the back of the troops.
After hubris.
So let's switch away from the English defense to the French offense. After the Battle of Blanchetaque, the French were in full pursuit of the English, and around noon on the 26th of August, 1346, they found them. The French army was split up into 4 sections: vanguard, 2 battalions, and a rear guard. The vanguard was made up almost entirely of hired crossbowmen and was followed by men-at-arms, which were led by Charles of Alencon, King Philip VI's brother, and
noses are always the first to go in headbusts or statues.
Men-at-arms, which were led by Charles of Alencon, King Philip VI's brother, and Philip's BFF, King
stop.
John of Bohemia, who, by the way, was blind. Following them was a contingent led by Duke Rudolph of Lorraine and Count Louis of Blois, both nobles loyal to Philip VI. Phil himself was in charge of the rearguard. Now, things seemed to go pretty orderly at first, but then news broke out that the English decided to put up a fight, and, well, how dare they do that? Because their constable, the army second in command, had been captured at Cannes, discipline was lost amongst the French. What this meant was that the French, mostly mounted men-at-arms, started to surge toward the tip of the convoy, eager to spill some blood. However, they soon realized that maybe, just maybe, they should wait for backup, and eventually the infantry and crossbowmen managed to catch up. The next logical steps would have been to A. Wait until everyone was there for good, B. Figure out a strategy, and C. Give some rest and respite to the exhausted troops after a 12.5-mile march.
Anything else
let's just
but what
say
you did?
that not one of the next French steps was logical. They didn't wait for the Count of Savoy, who was on his way with some support, to arrive. They didn't properly settle on a strategy because they were full of themselves due to having superior numbers, and ergo they figured out that a Zerg rush would work. And finally, and most stupid of all, they decided to attack the very same day. It's still unclear just why the attack...
So guys, they wouldn't look as like perfectly matching as this in real life, right? Like this painting is like showing everyone in this like perfect armor. I figured it'd be more of a ragtag group of different...
Of all, they decided to attack the very same day. It's still unclear just why the attack started on the 26th of August, but it did. Philip was likely against the attack, but his knights decided to take matters into their own hands and start the battle without him. I like to think of King Phil going from, "Hey, you lot listen to my commands, alright?" to pretty much, screw it. The first somewhat logical thing that happened after the French attack had begun was that they revealed the Oriflamme. This battle banner was of huge importance to France and had been used the first time in 1124 and originated in the monastery of St. Denis, the traditional burial site of the French kings. Flying it indicated no prisoners would be taken. And keep this in mind because it's important for what follows next. Oh, and by the way, did I mention yet that it positively pissed it down for the whole day? Heavy rains had been pouring down since the day before that. This was bad news for the French, or actually, they were Italian, but they were hired by the French, if we're precise, crossbowmen. While they didn't need to de-string their weapons, as the English had, so their bowstrings wouldn't become wet noodles, the rain also made the ground very muddy and soft. But if you're a crossbowman, you need hard ground to properly ram the top of your weapon into in order to reload it. And if that wasn't bad enough, their protective oversized shields were also still far, far away back in the carriage wagons, along with the rest of their ammo. But now the Italian crossbowmen's bad luck had run out and they had an epic archery battle with the fearsome English archers. Right? Well, no. While the crossbowmen did get some volleys in, the by now restrung longbows outranged the crossbows by a fair margin and their rate of fire was significantly higher. Plus, they couldn't even reload their weapons. It was probably at this point that the hired Italians decided to retreat. Now remember the Oriflamme, the take no prisoners flag thing? When the Italians turned around, they found themselves face to face with Count Alencon's division, and instead of being welcomed back into the French ranks, their bought allies saw them as cowards and/or traitors and proceeded to kill as many of them as possible. It's reported that King Philip VI said, "Kill me those scoundrels, for they stop up our road without any reason," upon seeing the crossbowmen flee.
Sorry, it's just funny how they have this more technologically advanced weapon in the crossbow compared to the bow, which has been around forever. And actually, I don't know how long the crossbow's been around. And yet they can't use it because they don't have the right tools. And then you just have these people, like, if it's not broken, don't fix it kind of message.
All the while, the English longbowmen used their superior range and continued to hail arrows into the French masses. It was a really bad day to be a crossbowman. After they decided to slice their allies to ribbons, Alencon and his folks decided on a cavalry charge, which, given the circumstances, muddy grounds, pits dug by the English, having to charge uphill, and being body blocked by thousands of fleeing Italians, maybe wasn't the best idea in that given situation. Also, their horses were only lightly armored, and many fell victim to English archers, which then resulted in the mounted warriors falling. These fallen men-at-arms and knights then were either caught up in the stampede, crushed by their horses, or armed comrades falling onto them. Don't forget, medieval armor was really heavy, or they were taken out of commission by other means.
I wonder who is more likely to come out of the battle alive. The rider of the horse or the horse itself, you know?
Maybe the worst way to go was drowning in mud. Good times. Meanwhile, the horses that did survive the hail of arrows broke into a wild panic, crashed into the still charging men-at-arms, and caused even more chaos. Once the first, oh yes, there were multiple, charge was over, and the French had been beaten back, the English infantry just walked up to the wounded French soldiers and killed them unceremoniously by knife or sword. The English also followed a no prisoners rule, and it showed. After the bloody upfront killing was done, arrows were recovered and the bodies were looted. At least one contemporary account describes the melee as murderous without pity, cruel, and very horrible. The second charge went much the same as the first one, just even more unorganized, but it was even harder because now the path was littered with corpses, both human and equine, which...
Sorry, question. That's a good point. So, after a large battle is done, was it common for everyone to do a kind of like line up and sweep through just to look at the bodies for any, whether it be treasure, but mainly like, they're not gonna have treasure. I mean, maybe they have like a gold necklace or something for luck. No, not gold. Forget. Just like go through for like arrows and certain nice armor or swords or whatnot. Like, would they do a sweeping of the battlefield over the corpses?
Made a closed, tight charge impossible. Regardless, they pressed on. One has to almost admire the sheer and foolhardy courage of the French soldiers, even when they faced highly likely doom. A high point and glimmer of hope for the French was a time when, according to one account, the 16-year-old Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne, was exhausted and beaten to his knees in the slaughter and carnage. He sent a knight to his father's camp for help, but famously King Edward III replied with, "Let the boy earn his spurs." Capturing or killing him may have turned the tide, but no such luck was had. Instead, after having something of an anime-style power-up, Prince Edward managed to escape out of harm's way. Meanwhile, the holes the French did manage to get into the defensive lines were simply filled up with fresh soldiers from the reserve. By now it was evening, the sun had long set, and instead of a calm night, the moaning and screams of wounded soldiers and the desperate neighing of horses would keep going until late. The results were, well, predictable. Things took a dramatic turn when King Philip VI was shot in the face, an arrow hitting his jaw. Afterwards, he noped out of there.
Imagine getting like knocked out on the battlefield or something, and like you just get like knocked out but not killed, but like you're unconscious for like 3 hours, or I don't know, and you just like wake up, like because everyone thinks you're dead. You just like wake up in a sea of dead bodies, or like if you're injured but not killed. And, like, if you have to, like, wait a day for blood or whatever to, loss of blood or whatever to take you down, like, because everyone can't just die instantly on the battlefield. There has to be people who survive but are incapacitated enough not to have a killing blow and just wither away.
When he sought refuge at a nearby castle, Le Bois, the sentry asked who went there. Allegedly, his voice laced with bitterness, Philip replied with, "Here stands the luck of France." And as if it were a symbolic occurrence for the French army, the sacred battle banner, the Oriflamme, was captured by the enemy. In the morning, the English men-at-arms swung themselves on their horses and all but hunted down the retreating French army. Seriously, everything had gone wrong for the French. You could almost feel bad for them. As with the actual soldiers on the field, it's hard to put into numbers the actual casualties in the battle. As is often the case with history, we need to rely on a lot of guesswork. It's been put forward that in the end, of an estimated 16,000 English troops, only a maximum of 300 were killed. As for the French numbers, estimates range from 10,000 to a probably inflated 30,000 common soldiers and up to 4,000 for nobles of varying rank. English heralds reported the death of 1,542 aristocratic men-at-arms and around 2,200 heraldic coats of arms being taken as loot. It can be definitively said that the dead included a ton of important people. Amongst them were the king's brother, Count Alencon, blind King John of Bohemia, who thought it was a good idea to charge into battle, bound into his saddle and balanced by two of his countrymen in the middle of the night, Duke Rudolph of Lorraine, and Count Louis I of Flanders. This
Get me my horse. We're going. Sir, you're blind. Did I stutter?
really hurt France.
Sorry. Okay. One of the big things that that confused the heck out of me at first, but now is becoming more understood by myself. Terrible sentence. Is I noticed that in the statistics of, or analytics of after battles of guns taken, casualties, how many died, how many captured, how many wounded, and also would be how many flags taken or standards taken or banners, whatever. And I'm always like, is that really a statistic worthy of being in the wounded and taking of guns, which are going to be really important? And it's become much more obvious to me why they're so important. It's like if you have this great symbol that has a lot of historical significance and a lot of pride of your army is tied to it, and the enemy knows of it, and then it gets captured, that's going to be a giant blow to the ego and to the lose face and what's it called, confidence. So that makes sense.
About as bad as the crippling defeat itself were the direct and indirect consequences. Firstly, the English now had little to no resistance to march on Calais. The town at the very northern pike of the French landscape was a very important trading post back then, and it still is to this day. Following their victory at Crecy, Edward and his guys waltzed up to the city and started their siege on the 4th of September 1346. It took 11 long months until August the 3rd, 1347, when the English finally managed to break the gates open and become lords of this important and very rich city. Now, 11 months is a long time, but in all of that time, the French army just couldn't break the siege or relieve the city of being starved out to the point of surrender. Crecy was still fresh in the collective French kingdom's mind. Calais would, after being taken in 1347, remain with the English and later the British Crown until 1558, when it was lost for good, along with all British possessions
The end of
on
the
continental
war?
Europe. Crecy also showed the sheer dominance and power of English longbows and their archers. The men trained in their use became sought-after mercenaries in all of Europe, even though the world was slowly entering the age of gunpowder. Ironically, English longbow archers were a big hit in Italy, who had supplied France with their rather ineffective crossbowmen at Crecy. Additionally, England was now well on its way to becoming a respected and feared military power. Finally, it seemed England was free of France's yoke and was seen as a strong, independent kingdom, ending a hierarchical dispute that had its root all the way back in 1066. The success that was had also reignited support for the war, which had been dwindling, and so the 100 Years' War continued. Also,
so this is a big. This I guess. So this is more of a. It seems like more of a big deal in English history than in French history, because the Franks and the French have been, I think, were more established, and so this is kind of the baptism of fire that the English get in coming into a worthy adversary on the world stage. It's really cool.
Tradition was made. The Black Prince Edward, who also was the Prince of Wales, adopted blind King John's motto and badge out of respect for the brave old man. The badge with the 3 white feathers in a crown was decorated with the motto Ich dien, or I serve. If it sounds familiar, that's been the badge and motto of every Prince of Wales to this day. So remotely, Crecy is still relevant to our modern world. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Why not check out one of our other videos, which is a huge victory for the French by Napoleon. It's called the Battle of Austerlitz, and I'm going to link to it on the screen
I've
now.
seen it. It was amazing. Great channel. Awesome. I want to get into Agincourt as well and learn a bit more about the 100 Years' War. Finish up Alexander. I got to do that. I'd like to get into Rome post Nero, maybe just post Augustus, maybe just post Caesar, honestly. So the first few emperors. 1700s, I got to get into the Spanish succession. Is the Austrian succession there? I want to learn about Maria Theresa. The 7 Years' War. Yeah, so a lot of stuff coming I want to learn about. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you learned something or can teach me something or just enjoyed it. Hope you're all doing well. See you next time.